Okay, so we are going to talk about beginnings and endings. I don't remember why I came up with it. I think I saw somebody uh, write about it somewhere, and I just thought maybe we could talk about how we approach beginnings and endings. And I don't know if anybody wants to start, but go ahead, Bertold, jumping in.
So I've been told by a lot of people that it's good to start a story off with a bang, with a lot of action. And I'm actually, as you know, Mark, I'm reading a Tom Clancy book right now.
Yeah.
And he does exactly that. Like the prologue starts off with like by page two, terrorists have come in and are holding everybody hostage and all this. And personally, this is something I've never really liked. I always feel maybe I shouldn't say always. It can work. Anything can work, right? But so often I read this and I feel like an author is just doing it because they think, well, this is what I'm supposed to do. So I'm going to start this off with as much action as I possibly can, just throwing it at the reader. And I kind of prefer a slow burn type story. And Audrey will know this. Like H.P. Lovecraft is very slow burn. It usually starts out with like somebody noticed something a little odd. So they went to the library and started looking into it a bit more. And it takes a while before we get to anywhere, but I'm okay with that. Um, and I have to close this though by saying, Tom Clancy sold a lot more books than I did, so maybe he was onto something.
Well, I'll pick that up since you mentioned H.P. Lovecraft. Yeah, his main thing wasn't character, it was atmosphere. So first he spent a lot of time creating the atmosphere so you'd kind of know where you were and what it felt like and all that stuff before he even introduced character. So yeah, there was that. Now, in terms of beginnings, I'm usually, you have an idea and you think, what a great idea. So you create that, and then it's very possible to just run out of gas. So I have to have both the initial idea and an ending, and then I can kind of work out the development. But if I just have the good idea, what if you had a situation where somebody was, something like this happened to them? Isn't that cool? But once you've kind of set that, you have to know where you're going. So that for me is the trick. And maybe that's why I have all these ideas written down that I haven't really done much with, because I'm not sure where they're going to end up. And I don't really want to invest the brain time in, sort of putting the initial idea into prose before I know where I'm headed. So that's my issue with beginnings.
Mm. Well, as somebody else who's not quite at the sales level of a Tom Clancy, I don't know how much weight I carry here, but I mean, I have two books out there, and I approached each one differently. But I do know that was drilled into me how important the opening line is of your book. And again, that goes back to like Berthold says it. And I struggled with that a lot because, I wasn't trying to write the next great American novel, or maybe the great American novel. I know if one's been written yet, but I decided with the first book, I just sort of ignored that for the moment because I wanted to create sort of an atmosphere in my mind when I was thinking about that first book ages ago. I had this idea of almost like someone telling a story, a fable. So when I had more of a plot in mind and everything else, I really made a conscious effort to just make the first chapter sound a little like a fable. Hopefully, at least start like that. Give this sort of flow of, there's this character and here's what they're doing, and then you meet somebody else, and and then it's just sort of a magical fable. So I tried to keep that. I don't know if I did or not, but I really tried to keep it so that the tone and mood changed afterwards. So I really wasn't trying to sell the book or get people, pulled in. I was just creating an atmosphere, mood. For the second book, though, is a Greek mythology retelling, but I was trying to be true to it. But I also wanted people to know right off the bat there should be some humor in this. So my opening line for that book was a king dealing with the annoyance of a gnat flying up his nose, so I wasn't, and again, not maybe great writing to say, oh, it starts with a gnat flying in somebody's nostril, but for humor, that's why I wanted to really hit that note right off the bat. So I mean, that's how I approached it. Right or not, I'll never know. But correct or not, I'll never know. But that was my intent. First, this fable, and the other would make sure you punch the humor in right away. So that's one other thing though. One other thing. You hear these rules now, and then how we don't like them, but don't have a prologue, don't have blah blah blah. But I'm starting to pull together a sequel, and again, for the sake of humor only, I may have 2 introductions. And I know you shouldn't have an introduction, but I didn't want to do a recap at all. But then I thought about it. And I said, you know what? If I have a recap introduction by one character and then a recap introduction by the other character, it could be really funny. So I may drop it, but right now I'm doing that. And again, there may be a rule out there, but as I've said on previous podcasts, whatever you want to consider as vidcast podcasts that we've had, for me, comedy has to be king in my book if that's the intent of the book, is to be humorous. So I'm going to ignore that rule if it's funny enough. So
I love that idea.
Yeah, about rules. Now, let's just revisit rules for a minute.
Yeah.
I think that what you need to do when you look at one of these rules is kind of try and figure out what the idea behind the rule is. So if your idea is not to, like to distract people or bore people or have using some kind of word too often, then I start to notice that. And once you start to notice that, it's like the dripping tap, right? You can't not notice it. And that kind of takes you right out of the story. So if you kind of figure out, okay, the rule is there to prevent this, but in my case, I'm going to avoid whatever the bad effect is by using some other technique. And also your reason for breaking rule. Like, Richard, you have a good reason, so it'll probably work just fine. But yeah, some of these rules are kind of, they have good intent, but you have to sort of analyze them instead of just following them blindly.
Actually, you triggered something in my mind that happened just the other day. One of the writers I interact with a lot, Holden Shepherd, he's an Aussie young adult writer. I would say up and coming, but I think now he's there. So, he's really making a name for himself in Australia. But he was showing some revisions of his most recent book he put out last year. And one of the things that he's, goes through a publisher. So he's not an indie. But one of the things that he pointed out is they made him take the titles of his chapters away. He said that apparently in the publishing area, that is just, they don't want to have title, just numbered chapters, no titles. And I said, well, why? Because as a reader, I find that useful to kind of remember where I encountered either lines of what was written or a plot point or whatever. And he said he loves them too, but he says that is the new publishing rule, and maybe because they think it's passé or whatever. And I'm just like, well, again, that's maybe where I would have a lot of difficulty. Because sometimes, you might want, I always think of the old Frasier show, you have these titles which don't make sense until the show goes on and then it becomes a punchline, So anyway,
sometimes titles just say something, it just adds just a little bit of additional something to how the story is told.
Right. I can remember, Pippin and Merry re-meeting Gandalf in the Two Towers because it's in a chapter called Flotsam and Jetsam. Now, I don't know why that's up there in my mind, but the Flotsam and Jetsam, was indicative of what was there around the tower, whatever. Again, I could probably remember other chapters and other stories for the same reason. But
I have to say something here. At the time that I was writing the Directorate, I initially had no chapter titles in it, just numbers. And then I read a post by Audrey about why chapter titles were good. And I was like, okay, you convinced me. So I added chapter titles.
Well, I like them in ebooks because if all you have is a list of chapters, because ebooks are hard to sort of flip back and forth in, and if you have your table of contents and you have chapter titles and you remember that this thing that you're looking for might probably happen in this particular chapter that's got a memorable title, then you can navigate better, and that's really my main reason. Now I think you have to be careful. You don't want to have those really long titles like they had in 18th or 19th century books, in which lady so and so goes out to gather flowers in the morning and blah blah. But you don't want those unless you can make it work somehow.
Right. If you're doing a parody of that, it would work. But
Yeah.
I'm reading someone's manuscript and they have chapter titles, and because I now have my Microsoft Office products on OneDrive, the problem is every time I close it, when I open it up again, it goes to the top of the document, not to where I last was reading. The chapter titles have helped me figure out where I am in the document.
yeah, I know.
I'm not going to remember chapter 13 as easily as I'm going to remember Stranger Things. That was the title of the last chapter I read.
In grad school, I studied human cognition, and that is just a fact. There's more your brain can pin on with words than it can with just a number.
Yeah.
So that's just a simple fact. So anyway, I didn't want to go down too much of a diversion, but it did trigger, and I thought would be a perfect time to bring that up.
So the thing for me with beginnings is, as with virtually everything we talk about, it depends. And I mean, I can go through, I think generally, I just come up with an idea and then I start writing it. And I think what I typically do is something kind of like what you said Lovecraft do, which is set the scene, set the environment that is where this story is going to start, or where all of it's going to happen. But I've done different things. My first novel, I basically wrote it that way, but then I decided, no, I have to have a chapter that starts it, that grabs people's attention. So I wrote a chapter that kind of jumped ahead a few days and was the woman who was involved in the event waking up and seeing that it wasn't exactly what she thought it was. When I wrote The Irreparable Past, I wrote that with the idea that I wanted to write something more poetic than I had written before, just in terms of the flow of the story and the rhythm of the story. So I decided to start each chapter with a poem, and wrote a poem for each of the first couple of chapters. Then I couldn't write poems for some of the last chapters, so I only had the poem at the beginning of that. The Dime, I know people who have told me they love the beginning, but I think the beginning is just flat, but it's just setting the stage for the story. So that's kind of my take. Is again, it depends on the story. It depends what is in my head at the time, how I want to approach it, and sometimes I approach it one way, and sometimes I approach it another way.
The argument sometimes is made that this is, the opening lines, your first is first impression, and I'm not sure how strongly that holds, especially today when you have, covers and blurbs and anything else, is really the first impression. After that, when someone decides to look inside, yeah, that could, but it, I think, in other words, I think we have a little bit more latitude than some of the original, perspectives were on that opening paragraph.
Well, there's two things about that, though. There's the opening paragraph for your reader in a finished book, a published book, and then there's the opening paragraph for the agent or whoever reads stuff at the publishers.
That is true. Yeah.
And those people read, tons of stuff, and they're always looking for a reason that this one won't make it because they have to work through their pile and so on. So it's different for them.
This is very true, and I do know this. I do this even talking with published authors that when you put a submission in, you don't grab them right away. So you are correct in that. So maybe if you're creating something as a submission, make sure that now that doesn't mean after once you've gotten some kind of publisher interest there that can't change later, because you may feel it's a little clunky on your own personal level. But yeah, that is true. You've got to grab the reader there, because you're right, they go through stacks of manuscripts. They're going to have like maybe 2 seconds to look at yours.
I was going to say the same thing, Audrey. I think a lot of this comes down to what the traditional publishing world and agents tell us we need to do, but it's based more on what they need rather than what the reading community needs. I can honestly say that I don't remember the first line of any book that I have ever read. The first line doesn't mean anything to me. I need to read at least, I don't know how many pages, but I don't know the first line of anything. I don't even know the first line of any book I've written, because it just doesn't, that's not what matters to me, both as a writer and as a reader.
Well, you better hope that any reader goes beyond the first line. But so there are there's lists of memorable first lines. I'm sure you could look them up. I was looking at something on Library Thing recently that had a whole list of memorable first lines, and yeah, I was thinking, yeah. Anyway, what was I going to say? I've forgotten. Now you guys better take this on.
No, that it's true. But those first lines are memorable because they're oft quoted. It's was the best of times, it's the worst times, whatever.
Yeah.
The hole in the ground, they live the hobbits, because they're quoted often, not because when first time you read it, you go, wow. It may hook you in some way, but yeah, I think that's the reason why more than anything else.
The first line isn't significant or meaningful until you've read the story, and then you realize, wow, that was a great way to start it, or something.
Right, right.
Yeah, right. That's true.
So, anything more on beginnings? Okay, now the next part, endings. And I'm going to start because one thing is my younger son, he says that I'm his favorite writer, but for the most part, that's because he doesn't read anything other than what I write these days, although he finally might be expanding his horizons. But he says I'm his favorite writer, but I'm also his least favorite writer because I don't ever end my stories. It's not a real ending to him. And I'm not exactly sure what he expects, but there's always things that are kind of left open. So again, I don't know how you approach endings, what your objective is with your ending.
Well, the main thing is to give the reader a good feeling, sort of a feeling of completion, where they close the book and they say, yeah, that's right, or that's good. Whether it's a happy ending or a sad ending or a mixed ending or just, and I think in literary fiction, with sort of realistic literary fiction, which is what you write, Mark, it's kind of, life doesn't sort of end unless you conclude your book with the character dying, and then that really is the end for them. But in most cases, it's kind of like they work out through some situation and they sort of resolve things, and you have a feeling that life is going to go on and there'll be other issues, but in the meantime you're saying goodbye to that character. So that works for that type of fiction. I think you sort of want a kind of a rise and a fall at the end, like the action goes up, and then something dramatic happens, whether it's sort of realistically dramatic or something really big, as in fantasy or science fiction or whatever, and then you kind of wrap it up. And I have to admit, I like to wrap things up with a sort of I wouldn't call it a what's the opposite of prologue? An epilogue. I wouldn't write a whole epilogue scene, but I kind of like to kind of meditate on the ending a bit and a few more. Have the character think about stuff, or draw some conclusions from what they've experienced, and then I end it. And I don't know, maybe some people think that's dragging things out too much, but I figure if they've gotten that far, they might as well hang in for another couple pages.
I think if by epilogue you mean like the stories that end with and this is what happened to John, and then this is what happened to Susie, and there's like this little neatly tied bow wrapped around each of the storylines or main characters. Is that what you mean?
Well, it could be, but I no, that isn't really what I mean. I mean, it's kind of a sort of the things calm down, and then you have the person. My things are all in first person, right? My novels. So, you have them maybe a few years later or a few months later,
Yeah.
kind of having some final thoughts about
Yeah.
things. Or maybe you kind of leap ahead and you see the character in a new situation that's kind of come out from the previous situation.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I'm thinking of my France in Egypt novels. Right? She Who Comes Forth and She Who Returns. Like in both of those, you kind of have her in the last chapter, sort of saying, "Well, here I am now, and this is my situation, and life is going on, and I've lost some things, and I've learned some things, and that's it."
Yeah.
But that's just me. I feel that's kind of necessary. It's like a coda in music, right? Classical music, you have this thing called a coda where you have, your symphony doesn't quite crash to an end. It kind of peters out. And that's sort of the way I like to do things.
Richard Berthold?
Okay, for me, for the two books that I put out, the endings were actually to me, the most critical part. All right, for the first book, I give you this, big sprawling story, and I am, again, it's comedy, so I'm a sucker for the happy endings where everything works out. I do that, but I know, being someone who also likes mysteries and things like that, I love a twist. So for that book, it was critical for me to come up with some kind of cool twist at the end, but I didn't want it to be a plot twist. And I really kept rethinking it and rewriting little parts of the book. And then it hit me, you know what I want? I want a motivation twist on one of the main characters. So you read the story, it all comes through, and then you have these follow-up 2 chapters that let you see one of the main characters and find out what is potentially, because you still never know that character, the true motivation. So it makes you, if anyone happened to read the book twice, which I doubt that'll ever happen, but if they did, if they really loved it, they wanted to read it twice, they would go back and now see that character in a slightly different light. And there are things he says throughout the story here, and there's just little crumbs that now you would look at and say, oh, I know why he said that now, because I know why he did what he did. At least I think I know. And the second book, this is the story of Perseus, and I cut it at one point because there are, I think, maybe 2 versions of the myth. There are many, but sort of go on a little bit after, like what happens after Perseus becomes, a king of wherever he is, and what happens after that. And it's, he actually ends up trading kingdoms, whatever. But I didn't go that far for a specific reason. As I mentioned before in other casts, that for me, I wanted to hit on the part of the story that got lopped out and was the critical part from the original Greek myth, which is that, a man, the king, is foretold his fate and he can't escape it. And that's why the title, Perseus Kills His Grandfather, was the reason why I put in the title. So that had to be the ending. I wasn't going to go, one word past that moment, pretty much. Where he ends up killing his grandfather. And of course, it is a big punchline, which is why I love that myth. It's actually sort of a twisted, dark humor ending to it. So I had to end it there. I didn't want to go past that because then it's like, well, change the title of the book then. So yeah, endings for me for those 2 books were, from a technical point of view, the way I was structuring my story, critical. Berto?
I like an ending that, at a minimum, leaves the reader with something to think about and makes the reader start to ponder what has happened. And at sort of the extreme, I like a thing sort of like Richard was talking about, where as you read the ending, you start to reevaluate everything that came before and sort of see it in a new light. That's almost the gold standard for me, but that's also that can be really hard. But at a minimum, I like the idea that most things are tied up, most things are explained, but there are some things that the reader is still thinking about. They're like, huh, I wonder what happened next is always a good thing, I think, although I think some readers hate that and are like, tell me what happened next. And my response is, I can't tell you what happened next. Think about it yourself. I told you enough. I'm kind
That's
of antagonistic that way.
the kind of a similar thought to that is my favorite stories are the ones where when I'm done, I want to keep reading about the characters.
Yes.
That the story has somehow impacted me enough that I'm not happy with 300 pages. I want more.
Yeah, that is a good standard to judge by. Yeah, one that where the book lingers in your mind, either because you're wondering, well, what happened to these people or this person after that, and also re-evaluating the whole plot, like what Berthold said about, you read the ending and then you look back and you realize, hey, that's what that meant, kind of thing. So yeah, those are really good things to aim for. I think the worst kind of ending is where it's obvious that the author really doesn't know how to end it, but they have to, and they kind of throw in some sort of sudden, unexplained things and kind of, amp it up to a kind of false climax, and then they kind of say, "Okay, done, good, goodbye."
Yeah,
It,
I've heard that.
in role playing games, there's a term for that where if the game master is just done and wants it all to be over with, they call it a rocks fall, everyone dies ending.
Well, I would say that most fiction has the opposite kind of okay, I'm done. I just need to end this where everybody is happy and it's a happy ending for everybody. That one of my absolute favorite books, and I never get the title right, is Wally Lamb. I know this much is true, or something like that. And it just is an incredible story. And then it ends with, and it's basically about twins, one of them who's schizophrenic, and the schizophrenic brother eventually dies, but it ends with the other brother winning the lottery. And it's like, why? Why did he have to win the lottery?
It's funny because I saw the adaptation of it with Mark Ruffalo, and they didn't do that part, the second part with the lottery. Interesting, because I never got a chance to read it yet.
Oh, well, I'm sorry. I ruined the ending for you.
No, it's okay because it was the way they ended it was more about a writer's journey.
Yeah.
It was kind of cool. So,
Do you feel like you have to give your reader a happy ending?
No,
no, I probably will. So again, it's the tone I want, but no, I don't owe them anything except a good story.
Well, yeah, but if your books are humorous, basically, I think you sort of have to have a positive ending.
Right,
Unless
right.
you're morbidly humorous.
That's true. But it's still, yeah, but then, yeah, it's still an ending when you're smiling somehow.
but it's all what the story demands, um yeah, I could see writing something that didn't end happily.
I think what you just said, it's what the story demands. That's what the ending should be. And if the ending is inconsistent with what the story has been up to that point, then it's just not right.
Yeah.
My wife has taken to reading things that I finished and said, "Oh, and of course Pete had to run off, didn't he? You had to make Pete leave, right? Or you had to make so and so die, didn't you? Right? Yeah. Well, yeah, I did. Sorry."
That's true. Yeah, one of my beta readers for She Who Returns, yeah, I kind of objected strenuously to the death of one of the characters. But there was just no way that that person wasn't going to die. I pretty well set them up as a sacrificial person, right, from about halfway on. I thought, oh yeah, that's what's going to happen. This guy is going to not come out of this very well. So yeah.
Do people die in real life?
I've heard rumor.
Inconveniently too sometimes.
Yes, yes.
I shouldn't give this away, but I wrote a line, and again, this whole chapter may go, but there's this teenager who's really angry at her dad, and she's and Mephistopheles, one of my characters, is there, and she says, she goes on this little tirade and goes, "I just wish he was dead." And Mephistopheles says, "Don't ever say that." He said, "Everybody dies. You're wasting a perfectly good wish."
That's cool.
That is a good one.
That's so good. If you want, Richard, I'll edit that out when we publish this so it can surprise people.
No, it's all right. They could steal it too. I have proof that I wrote it here first.
That's true.
By the way, we're at about 5 minutes left.
Okay. That was a good conversation anyway. It really went fast.
Anything anybody else wants to talk about?
Well, I guess the old AI thing, I don't know if it's getting old yet, but finally I was going to do that experiment story where I wrote a story and then I'll get an AI to write something based on the elements in that story. So I finally actually got the story down. It's actually typed up. I just have to kind of polish it up a bit. I wanted to do it to complete it myself before I turned to the AI so that I wasn't influenced by whatever it came up with. So I'll just let it go and do its thing. But to be honest, I haven't engaged with any AIs yet, so I don't even know which one I'm going to pick for it.
Do you know what is about to occur to me is I was like, oh, you could publish sort of the two versions or something. But then I read a line somewhere the other day that there's a law that I may be wrong, but you cannot copyright AI generated material.
Oh.
I kind of seems to make sense on some level, but
all sorts of people putting AI into things now that I bet they think they're copywriting.
Right, but it's not there. Yeah, they don't technically.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, this is kind of a throwaway on both counts, so I don't really worry about if the AI version is copyright or not.
Well,
but
I know.
I will post them either on my blog or our blog, Writers Supporting Writers, and then reblog it on my blog. So eventually you will see these two. It's like about 2,000 words though. So I don't know what the AI will come up with, but it'll be quite a post.
Well, I tried that experiment and asked it to write a 2,500 word story, and it gave me a less than 600 word story.
Oh.
Got lazy.
AIs are very lazy.
Yeah.
If you tried the WordPress AI assistant thing, it basically says, give me all the information you want. It basically says, write it for me, and then I'll rewrite it in different words. Pretty much what it's doing.
Well, I tried it with a post about hardy geraniums, and it actually pulled together a bunch of basics about those kind of plants and put them out there, and even tips on what are the best growing conditions. So you have to hand it to it. But it was kind of vanilla flavored, to be honest. So
those are the kinds of things that I think AI would be good for, or recipes or things like that. But the reality is, how to pot a geranium, all you have to do is go to Google and say how to pot a geranium, and you'll find 83,000 websites that will tell you how to pot a geranium.
Videos too.
And video, right? YouTube video.
Yeah. So anyway, okay, I guess we're done.
Yeah.
I guess
Do it however you want, right?